Humanity did not leave its cradle in a blaze of triumph or prophecy. It left because the cradle cracked, not all at once, but with a patient cruelty that let every generation believe it might be the last to fix things. The oceans climbed in millimeters that turned into meters. The fields failed in patterns too complex for anger and too predictable for hope. By the time the first interstellar vessel burned its way out of orbit, the people watching from below were not cheering. They were calculating who would be left behind and what names would be carved into the side of a ship that would never come back for them. The ship carried no banners. It carried ledgers, seeds sealed in frost, and a few thousand souls who had learned to measure optimism in grams rather than dreams. That was how humanity learned to survive among the stars, not as conquerors, not as chosen heirs, but as borrowers of time who always intended to pay their debts. Generations later, the port at Kepri Reach hung like a crown of metal and light around a gas giant the color of bruised jade. It was not a human station by origin, though humans now made up a third of its population. The Reach had been built by a species whose bodies grew in branching spirals and whose language had no word for ownership, only for stewardship. When their civilization withdrew inward for reasons no outsider fully understood, they sold or gifted their works rather than abandon them. Humans had arrived with cargo holds full of questions and contracts, and they had stayed because the station accepted their kind of careful persistence. Kepri Reach became a place where species met not to celebrate unity, but to negotiate coexistence in margins thin enough to cut. Mara Quince stood at the edge of Dock 17, watching a freighter ease into its berth with the patience of a creature that understood mass better than urgency. She was not tall by human standards, though years in low gravity had stretched her bones into something lean and deceptive. Her hair was bound tight against her skull, more from habit than regulation, and her eyes tracked the alignment lights with an intensity that made stevedores step aside without knowing why. She had been born on a ship, raised on stations, and taught that gravity was a privilege rather than a guarantee. To her, planets were rumors you visited briefly and then escaped before they claimed you. Kepri Reach was comfortable in the way only a compromise could be, and she trusted it the way one trusts a bridge that has never fallen, not because it was beautiful, but because it was inspected every day by people who would die if it failed. The freighter's hull was scored with micrometeor scars and older marks that told stories of hurried repairs done far from any port. Its registry was human, though the engine's signature bore modifications common among the Jaspin Collective, a trade network whose members had learned to tune reactors like instruments, each with its own temper and tone. As the docking clamps locked, Mara's wrist console chimed, pulling her attention from the ship to the list of arrivals. One name flashed with a priority marker that made her jaw tighten. The message header was stamped with the seal of the Interstellar Arbitration Assembly, an organization that pretended neutrality the way predators pretended sleep. She did not open it yet. Instead, she watched the airlock cycle and counted breaths. Around her, Dock 17 hummed with the layered noises of 1,000 species doing business. There was the low vibration of cargo sleds, the hiss of atmosphere regulators compensating for leaks too small to bother fixing, the murmur of voices that carried clicks, tones, and harmonics human throats could not replicate. Humans had adapted by listening more than speaking, by learning when silence was useful and when it was dangerous. Mara had learned that lesson early, though she had also learned that there were times when silence was a luxury she could not afford. The first to emerge from the freighter was not the person she was expecting. Instead, a being stepped through the airlock whose form suggested a life evolved under heavier gravity, its body compact and layered with dense muscle beneath a hide patterned in mottled blues and grays. Its eyes were set wide, giving it a field of vision that made it hard to surprise, and its hands ended in 3 thick fingers tipped with blunt nails. It wore a pressure harness adapted for the station's mixed atmosphere and carried a data case clutched to its chest with something like protectiveness. Mara recognized the species from briefings, a Karth envoy, rare this far from their home clusters and rarer still in human-registered vessels. Behind the Karth envoy came the human delegation, and at their head walked Tomas Rel. He moved with the loose confidence of someone who had spent most of his life in places where rules were suggestions enforced by social memory rather than law. His face was lined not by age, but by decisions, the kind that left marks because they had been made quickly and lived with slowly. He spotted Mara almost immediately and smiled, a small, tired expression that acknowledged shared history without pretending it was pleasant. She returned the smile with one of her own, thinner and sharper, and stepped forward to meet him. "Took you long enough," she said, pitching her voice to cut through the ambient noise without rising into aggression. "Customs argued with us about the manifest," Tomas replied. "They always do. This time they were right." Mara glanced at the Karth envoy, who watched the exchange with a stillness that suggested careful attention. "You going to introduce me, or do I get to guess?" Tomas gestured with an open hand, palm up, a human sign meant to indicate respect without submission. "This is Seneschal Threx of the Karth Conclave. Seneschal, this is Mara Quince, logistics coordinator for Kepri Reach and the closest thing this station has to a conscience." The Karth inclined its head, the movement precise and economical. "Your reputation precedes you," Threx said, its voice filtered through a translator that struggled with the deeper frequencies. "That is not a compliment or an insult. It is an observation." Mara nodded. "Observations keep people alive. Welcome to the Reach." As dockworkers moved in to begin offloading cargo, Mara finally opened the message from the assembly. The text scrolled across her console with all the warmth of a legal instrument, informing her that an arbitration hearing had been scheduled regarding a dispute between the Karth Conclave and the Aurelian Pact, with Kepri Reach designated as neutral ground. The subject of the dispute was resource access to a region of space recently revealed to contain a dense cluster of habitable worlds. The timing was not coincidental, and the mention of neutral ground made Mara's stomach knot. Neutrality was a myth maintained by those who benefited from others believing in it. She looked up at Tomas. "You brought more than cargo." He sighed, the sound heavy with resignation. "We always do." They moved away from the dock toward a quieter corridor, Threx following with measured steps. The walls here were grown rather than built, their surfaces smooth and faintly luminescent, responding to touch with subtle shifts in color that indicated structural health. As they walked, Mara's mind raced through implications and contingencies. A resource dispute involving multiple non-human powers was dangerous enough. Involving humanity, even indirectly, was worse. Humans had a reputation now, one earned through a century of careful desperation and stubborn refusal to disappear. They were seen as adaptable, relentless, and inconveniently ethical when it suited them. They were also seen as expendable by those who measured worth in territorial control. "What exactly is in that cluster?" Mara asked. Tomas hesitated, then shrugged. "Enough water and biomass to support multiple civilizations, enough to change the balance of trade in this sector, enough to make people forget old agreements." Threx's eyes shifted, focusing on Tomas. "The Conclave does not forget agreements," it said. "People do," Tomas replied, "even when they belong to collectives that claim otherwise." They reached an observation chamber overlooking the gas giant below, its storms churning in slow, majestic violence. The room was empty, designed for contemplation rather than meetings, but it would serve. Mara gestured for them to sit, then leaned against the railing, folding her arms. She felt the weight of the station beneath her feet, the accumulated trust of thousands of lives that depended on her making the right calls more often than not. "The Assembly wants to arbitrate," she said. "That means they expect someone to lose quietly." Threx considered this. "The Conclave seeks equitable distribution." Mara snorted softly. Everyone says that. Equity looks different depending on how much you already have. Tomas watched her, his gaze searching. You sound like you already know where this is going. I know how it usually goes, she replied. Humans get asked to facilitate because we are seen as flexible. We are expected to absorb the consequences because we always have. Threx's posture shifted, a subtle sign of discomfort or perhaps curiosity. Why do you agree to such roles? Mara met its gaze. Because if we do not, someone else will, and they will do it worse. Because we learned a long time ago that being present is the only way to influence outcomes when you lack overwhelming force. The observation chamber lights dimmed slightly as the station adjusted its power flow. Outside, a lightning storm flashed across the gas giant's surface, illuminating the clouds in brief, violent beauty. Mara watched it and thought of Earth, of storms that had once been weather and had become weapons. She thought of the first ships, of ledgers and seeds, of promises written in the margins of extinction. The hearing will be a spectacle, Tomas said. The Aurelians will posture, the conclave will present data, the assembly will smile and pretend this is about law. And what will humans do? Threx asked. Mara pushed off the railing and straightened. We will do what we always do. We will listen. We will remember, and when the time comes, we will decide whether survival requires compromise or defiance. Tomas raised an eyebrow. That sounds ominous. It is practical, she replied. There is a difference. As they stood there, a message pinged across the station network, announcing the arrival of an Aurelian delegation. The timing was precise, calculated to assert presence without overt aggression. Mara closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them, feeling the familiar tightening in her chest that came before hard work. She did not believe in destiny, but she believed in consequences, and she knew that Kepri Reach was about to become a fulcrum on which more than resources would balance. Get settled, she said to Tomas and Threx. We convene in 12 standard hours. Until then, this station is your refuge. Do not make me regret offering it. Threx inclined its head again. The conclave respects refuge. Tomas smiled, this time without humor. We will try not to break anything. Mara watched them leave, then turned back to the storm-racked giant below. Humanity had come a long way from a cracked cradle, carrying its ledgers and seeds into the dark. It had learned to borrow space, to rent time, to survive on promises that had to be kept, because there was no one else to enforce them. Now, as old powers circled new worlds like sharks scenting blood, humanity would be asked again what it was willing to pay to remain standing. Mara Quince did not know the answer yet, but she knew this. Whatever the cost, humans would calculate it carefully, and they would pay it themselves rather than let someone else decide their worth. The assembly chamber aboard Kepri Reach had been designed by architects who believed geometry could enforce civility. Its walls curved inward, not enough to feel claustrophobic, but enough to discourage grand gestures. The seating tiers spiraled gently downward toward a central dais that held no throne, only a ring of adjustable platforms calibrated to accommodate bodies that ranged from gelatinous to rigidly armored. Above it all hung a lattice of translucent panels that filtered the station's ambient light into a neutral spectrum, stripping away the color biases of different species, visual ranges. The chamber did not demand peace, but it made violence inconvenient, which was the closest thing to optimism that space had ever afforded. Mara stood at the periphery as delegations filtered in, her presence unofficial but expected. She wore no insignia beyond a small seal denoting her authority over station logistics, a reminder that neutrality was maintained not by words, but by control of air, water, and power. Her console streamed biometric summaries and environmental readouts, her fingers flicking through them with the ease of long practice. The Aurelians arrived in a cluster, their forms tall and reed-thin, their skin a pale opalescent sheen that caught the chamber light and fractured it into subtle rainbows. They moved with synchronized grace, each step mirrored by the others, a display meant to suggest unity and inevitability. At their center floated their speaker, suspended by a gravitic harness that hummed softly, a technological concession to a species that preferred to keep its limbs unencumbered. The Karth delegation entered next, fewer in number, but heavier in presence. Their movements were slower, each step deliberate, their mass pressing into the chamber floor with a confidence born of density. Threx took its place among them, its data case now docked to a port on its harness, feeding streams of information into the assembly's shared systems. Tomas arrived last among the human representatives, his group modest, their attire functional rather than ceremonial. Humans had learned early that ostentation invited scrutiny, and scrutiny invited expectations they could not always meet. When all parties were seated, the assembly's moderator activated, a construct of light and sound shaped vaguely like a bipedal silhouette, its features deliberately indistinct. The moderator spoke in a voice that shifted subtly to accommodate each listener's auditory range, a feat of engineering that impressed newcomers and irritated veterans. It welcomed the delegations, outlined procedural formalities, and framed the dispute in language so sanitized it could have been describing a disagreement over docking fees rather than the future of entire ecosystems. Mara listened, her attention divided between the words and the reactions they provoked. The Aurelian speaker's skin rippled faintly at certain phrases, a sign of internal recalibration. Threx remained still, its wide eyes unblinking, though Mara noted the minute flexing of its fingers, a Karth tell she had learned to recognize during previous negotiations. Tomas leaned back slightly, arms crossed loosely, his expression attentive but guarded. Humans had perfected the art of appearing relaxed while braced for impact. The first presentations were predictable. The Aurelians spoke of historical presence, of migratory patterns that had brought them near the newly charted cluster centuries ago. They spoke of need framed as destiny, of expansion as a natural right. Their language was poetic, laden with metaphors of growth and balance, but beneath it lay a clear assertion. They intended to claim the majority of the cluster, and they expected the assembly to legitimize that claim. The Karth response was data-driven, a cascade of projections and models demonstrating sustainable use, equitable distribution, and long-term stability. Threx spoke rarely, allowing the numbers to argue, but when it did, its words were precise, cutting through rhetoric with the weight of accumulated analysis. Humans were invited to speak last, a courtesy that was also a test. Tomas rose, smoothing the front of his jacket, and walked to the dais. He did not project images or invoke ancient claims. Instead, he spoke of precedent, of past disputes resolved poorly and the scars they had left. He spoke of humanity's own history, not as a cautionary tale delivered with moral superiority, but as an accounting of mistakes made under pressure. He did not ask for control of the cluster. He asked for time, for shared stewardship, for an agreement that would prevent the kind of resource rush that turned living worlds into commodities before anyone learned their names. The chamber was quiet when he finished, the kind of quiet that followed an unexpected note in a familiar song, though no one would have described it that way aloud. The moderator thanked him and opened the floor for deliberation. As expected, the debate quickly bogged down in definitions and jurisdictional nuances, each side probing for weakness without committing to open hostility. Mara watched the assembly members, noting who asked questions and who avoided eye contact. Neutrality was always selective. As the hours dragged on, she felt a familiar frustration gnaw at her. This was the dance she had seen too many times, the slow grind toward a compromise that satisfied no one but allowed the powerful to claim legitimacy. She monitored station systems, ready to intervene if tempers flared into something more dangerous. Kepri Reach had weathered riots, sabotage attempts, and one memorable incident involving a species whose defensive reflexes included explosive spore release. It would weather this too, but at what cost? The first real fracture appeared when the Aurelian speaker proposed a timeline for settlement that ignored Carth projections entirely. Threx responded with a recalibration of its own, adjusting its models to account for Aurelian demands and demonstrating, with brutal clarity, how such a timeline would lead to ecological collapse within 3 generations. The speaker dismissed the projection as alarmist, its skin flaring brighter, the chamber lights reflecting off it in sharp glints. Voices rose, translators struggling to keep pace as emotional frequencies spiked. The moderator intervened, calling for recess. Delegations retreated to their assigned chambers, tensions simmering just below the surface. Mara exhaled slowly, feeling the ache in her shoulders. She had hoped for better, though she could not say why. Hope was a habit she tried to break, but it clung stubbornly. She found Tomas in a side corridor, staring at a maintenance panel as if it held secrets. "That went well," he said dryly. "Define well," Mara replied. He shrugged. "No one threw anything, yet." Threx joined them, its gait unchanged, though Mara sensed an undercurrent of agitation. "The Aurelian position is incompatible with sustainability," it said. "They disregard data that conflicts with their objectives." "They always do," Tomas said. "So does everyone when the stakes are high enough." Mara folded her arms. "The Assembly will push for a split that looks fair on paper and fails in practice. The cluster will be carved up, and the consequences will be delayed just long enough for everyone responsible to be elsewhere." Threx studied her. "You speak as if this outcome is inevitable." "It usually is," she replied, "unless someone disrupts the pattern." Tomas met her gaze. "You have something in mind." She hesitated, weighing risks. Kepri Reach's neutrality was its shield, but it was also a cage. To act openly would invite retaliation, not just against the station, but against humanity's tenuous standing. Yet to do nothing felt like complicity. She thought of the ledgers carried off Earth, of promises written in margins. She thought of survival as a series of small defiance acts that accumulated into persistence. "There is another option," she said slowly, "one the Assembly does not like." Threx's eyes widened fractionally. "Explain." "The cluster is uninhabited by sentient life, but it is not unclaimed in every sense," Mara said. "There are presentient biospheres, complex ecosystems that meet the criteria for protected status under Assembly Charter. That status has been ignored before, but only when enforcement was inconvenient." "And you propose enforcement?" Tomas asked. "I propose recognition," Mara replied. "Human survey teams have extensive experience documenting emerging biospheres. If we present irrefutable evidence, the Assembly would be forced to designate the cluster as a preservation zone, at least temporarily. That buys time. It forces cooperation." Threx considered this. The Conclave would support such documentation. Tomas frowned. "The Aurelians will contest it. They will accuse humanity of manipulation." "They already assume that," Mara said. "The difference is whether we give them proof." Silence settled between them, heavy with implication. This would be a gamble, one that put humanity squarely in the spotlight. It would require rapid deployment, coordination across species lines, and a willingness to absorb political backlash. It would also align with the principles humans like to claim, even when they were inconvenient. Tomas sighed. "We would need authorization." "You have it," Mara said. "From me for what it's worth, and from every person on this station who would rather see living worlds studied than strip-mined." Threx inclined its head. "The Conclave will commit resources." Tomas looked between them, then nodded. "All right, let us disrupt the pattern." They moved quickly after that. Messages were sent through secure channels, requests framed as routine surveys, teams assembled from volunteers who understood the risks. Mara coordinated logistics with ruthless efficiency, diverting supplies, allocating docking slots, ensuring that nothing appeared overtly extraordinary. To an outside observer, Kepri Reach continued its steady hum of commerce and coexistence. Beneath that surface, however, Plans unfolded with the quiet intensity of people who knew they were borrowing time. When the assembly reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted. The Aurelians pressed harder, sensing resistance, their speakers' language sharpening. The Carth remained steadfast, their data now bolstered by preliminary findings from the survey teams, hints of complexity that demanded caution. Tomas spoke again, this time with evidence in hand, images and analyses that painted the cluster not as empty real estate, but as a tapestry of nascent life. The reaction was immediate and volatile. Accusations flew, counterarguments rose, and the moderator struggled to maintain order. Mara watched from the sidelines, her heart pounding. This was the point of no return. The assembly could choose to acknowledge the findings, to enforce its own charters, or it could dismiss them and reveal its hypocrisy to everyone watching. In the end, it did what institutions always did under scrutiny. It compromised. The cluster was designated a provisional preservation zone, subject to ongoing study and limited access. Settlement was delayed, resource extraction restricted. It was not a victory, but it was not a loss. It was a pause, a breath held in the hope that something better could be built before the exhale. As delegations filed out, reactions mixed, Mara allowed herself a moment of relief. Tomas caught her eye and gave a small nod, gratitude and exhaustion intertwined. Threx paused before leaving, its gaze steady. "You have altered the trajectory," it said. "The conclave will remember this." "So will others," Mara replied. Later, alone in the observation chamber, she looked out at the gas giant once more. The storm had shifted, its patterns changed by forces invisible from this distance. Humanity had not claimed new worlds that day. It had not expanded its territory or asserted dominance. It had done something quieter and perhaps more dangerous. It had insisted that the future be considered before it was spent. Mara knew the reprieve would not last forever. The cluster would be contested again, the assembly's resolve tested. Humanity would be blamed, resented, courted, and threatened. That was the cost of stepping into the light. But as she watched the swirling clouds below, she felt the familiar resolve settle into her bones. Humans had survived by borrowing stars, by paying debts others ignored. They would continue to do so, one calculated risk at a time, until survival was no longer a favor granted by indifferent powers, but a right they enforced themselves. The provisional designation changed nothing and everything at once. On paper, the cluster beyond the mapped corridors became a preservation zone, its coordinates flagged with cautionary markers and legal language dense enough to deter casual infringement. In practice, it became a magnet. Every power that had ignored the region before now sent feelers, scouts, and observers, each claiming interest in science, stability, or oversight. Kepri Reach felt the strain almost immediately. Traffic increased, docking schedules tightened, and the careful equilibrium of the station began to wobble under the weight of attention. Mara slept less, ate standing up more often than not, and learned to recognize the sound of incoming priority messages by the way her teeth clenched before her console chimed. Human survey teams returned first, their vessels bearing not triumph, but data, vast and intricate. They had catalogued biomes layered like palimpsests, worlds where life had not yet learned to speak, but had learned to cooperate in ways that defied simple models. There were forests that grew in concentric waves, responding to stellar radiation cycles, and oceans whose microbial ecosystems regulated planetary temperature with a precision that bordered on artistry. To the humans who documented them, these places were not resources waiting to be unlocked, but stories mid-sentence. They spoke of them with reverence tempered by the knowledge that reverence alone rarely saved anything. The Carth followed with their own analyses, integrating human findings into broader models that demonstrated how fragile these systems were, how easily a single misstep could cascade into collapse. Threx oversaw the synthesis personally, its attention unwavering, its communication with Mara frequent and precise. Between them developed a rhythm of exchange that needed few explanations. They trusted each other not because of shared ideals, but because each had proven willing to act when inaction was easier. The Aurelians did not send surveyors. They sent lawyers, diplomats, and private contractors whose vessels loitered at the edges of permitted space, their transponders flickering with just enough ambiguity to test enforcement protocols. The Assembly issued warnings, then statements, then convened committees to discuss the language of those statements. It was the familiar progression toward paralysis. Mara watched it unfold with a sense of grim inevitability, even as she coordinated with station security to tighten monitoring and ensure that no unauthorized expeditions launched from Kepri Reach. Tomas became a frequent presence in her office, a space carved out of what had once been a maintenance alcove. The walls bore the faint outlines of old conduits, reminders that this station, like humanity itself, had been repurposed to meet needs its creators had never anticipated. Tomas brought news from beyond the reach, fragments of intelligence gleaned from human networks scattered across the sector. He spoke of alliances forming quietly, of species who saw in the preservation zone not a barrier but a precedent. He also spoke of threats, couched in careful language, of whispers that humanity was overreaching, that its insistence on caution masked an agenda of control. "They are afraid," Mara said during one such briefing, her fingers tracing idle patterns on her console. "Of losing opportunity," Tomas replied, "of setting limits. Limits are not new," she said. "They just resent who is drawing them." He nodded. "There is talk of a challenge, formal at first. If that fails, less so." Mara leaned back, the chair creaking softly. "Define less so." "Probing actions," Tomas said. "Incursions framed as accidents, data theft, discrediting campaigns, the usual." She sighed. "And we are the fulcrum." "You always are," he said. "You sit at the junction of logistics and ethics. People assume you will bend." She met his gaze. "Do you?" He smiled faintly. "I know you will bend the right way." The first incident came sooner than expected. A research vessel registered to a minor trade consortium attempted to enter the preservation zone, citing an outdated chart and claiming navigational error. Karth monitors flagged the trajectory early, and Mara ordered station authorities to interdict. The vessel complied after brief protest, but its crew transmitted a flurry of data bursts before turning back. Analysis later suggested they had mapped mineral deposits and gravitational anomalies, information that would be valuable to anyone planning future exploitation. The Assembly issued a mild rebuke and updated its guidelines. The Aurelians expressed concern about overzealous enforcement. Humanity lodged a formal complaint that went nowhere. It was a small skirmish, but it set a pattern. Each incursion tested boundaries, each response measured and weighed by unseen observers. The preservation zone became a chessboard, and Kepri Reach sat uncomfortably close to the center. Threx requested a private meeting not long after. They met again in the observation chamber. The gas giant storms a familiar backdrop. Threx spoke without preamble. "The Conclave has identified a probability spike." Mara raised an eyebrow. "Of what?" "Escalation," Threx said. "Specifically, an attempt to force a revision of the preservation status through destabilization." Mara frowned. "Define destabilization." "Economic pressure on Kepri Reach," Threx replied. "Supply chain disruptions, political isolation." "If the station's neutrality is compromised, the Assembly may relocate arbitration authority elsewhere." Mara felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. "They would choke us out." "Yes," Threx said. "Indirectly, plausibly." She paced, boots whispering against the chamber floor. "We have reserves, redundancies." "For a time," Threx said, "but the reach depends on trade. If enough partners withdraw, the strain becomes unsustainable." Mara stopped, meeting its gaze. "What does the Conclave propose?" "The Conclave will increase its presence," Threx said. "Publicly, we will route additional trade through the reach, offsetting losses." That would be noticed, Mara said. Yes, Threx agreed. It would signal alignment. She exhaled slowly and paint a larger target. Threx inclined its head. Correct. Mara considered this, weighing options. Humanity had allies, but few with the Conclave's resources. Accepting such support would tie their fates more closely, for better or worse. Refusing might leave the Reach vulnerable. She thought of the station's inhabitants, of the fragile ecosystem of coexistence she had helped maintain. She thought of Earth, of the cost of delay. Do it, she said finally, but quietly, where possible, spread it out. Threx's eyes flickered, an expression Mara had come to interpret as satisfaction. The Conclave values discretion. The economic pressure began regardless. Shipping insurance rates spiked. Certain ports delayed human vessels for inspections that found nothing and cost everything in time. Rumors circulated of safety concerns at Kepri Reach, amplified by anonymous channels. Mara countered with transparency, releasing inspection reports, opening station systems to external audits. It helped, but only partially. Fear was easier to spread than trust. Within the station, tensions rose. Some inhabitants questioned the wisdom of involvement in off-station politics. Others rallied, forming committees and support networks, determined to weather whatever came. Mara attended meetings until her voice went hoarse, explaining, listening, absorbing anger and fear without deflecting it. Leadership, she had learned, was not about convincing everyone, but about standing still long enough for others to push against you and not fall over. The second incident was more serious. An unmanned probe detonated near the preservation zone's boundary, its explosion calibrated to mimic a natural event while releasing a cloud of nanoscale sensors. The sensors dispersed, embedding themselves in nearby asteroids and debris, forming a covert monitoring network. Human and Karth systems detected the anomaly quickly, but removing the sensors without revealing the detection capabilities used to find them posed a dilemma. Leave them, and information leaked. Remove them, and reveal strength. Mara convened an emergency council, pulling in Tomas, Threx, and representatives from station security. The room was tense, the air thick with unspoken stakes. We cannot pretend this is an accident, she said. Someone is testing us. Likely the Aurelians, Tomas said, or a proxy acting on their behalf. Threx nodded. The signature matches known Aurelian technology modified. Mara tapped her console, bringing up options. We can expose it publicly, force the assembly to respond, and risk escalation, Tomas said, or we can quietly neutralize it, Mara said. Preserve the illusion. Threx considered. Neutralization without detection is possible but not guaranteed. Mara closed her eyes briefly. The illusion of peace had value, but so did precedent. If this went unanswered, it would invite more aggressive actions. Humanity had learned painfully that boundaries unenforced were boundaries erased. We expose it, she said, carefully, with evidence. The decision rippled outward. Data packets were prepared, sensor schematics annotated, explosion models compared. The information was released simultaneously to the assembly, major trade networks, and independent media channels known for credibility. The narrative was controlled not through rhetoric, but through detail. This was not an accusation, it was an accounting. The reaction was swift and chaotic. The Aurelians denied involvement, their speakers' statements increasingly strained. The assembly launched an investigation, appointing a panel whose members were chosen with suspicious balance. Some trade partners expressed outrage, others concern, a few cautious support. Kepri Reach saw a surge of traffic as observers arrived to see the station at the heart of the storm. Mara stood at her office viewport, watching ships come and go, each a potential ally or adversary. She felt the weight of every decision pressing down, a gravity stronger than any planet S. Tomas joined her, silent for a moment. You knew this would happen, he said. Yes, she replied. I just hoped it would take longer. He smiled ruefully. Hope again. She shook her head. No, prepare. The investigation dragged on, mired in procedural delays. Meanwhile, the preservation zone held, its status reinforced by scrutiny. No new incursions occurred, but the standoff hardened. Humanity found itself in an uncomfortable spotlight, praised by some as principled, condemned by others as meddlesome. Within human networks, debates flared. Was this worth the cost? Was preservation a luxury humanity could afford when its own colonies still struggled? Mara answered these questions not with speeches, but with action. She authorized additional humanitarian shipments to struggling outposts, funded research collaborations that shared benefits rather than hoarded them. She made the case, implicitly, that ethics were not a zero-sum game. It was exhausting work, and she felt the toll in her bones, but she did not slow. One night, as artificial dusk settled over Kepri Reach, she received a message marked with the highest priority. It was from Threx, brief and uncharacteristically urgent. New data, it read, probability of direct confrontation increasing, recommend immediate consultation. Mara did not hesitate. She headed for the observation chamber, her mind racing through scenarios. The borrowed time humanity had secured was running out. The question was no longer whether the pattern would be disrupted, but whether the disruption would be enough to change its outcome. The observation chamber felt smaller than it ever had, though its dimensions had not changed. Mara stood near the railing, hands clasped behind her back, eyes fixed on the slow churn of the gas giant below. The storms had shifted again, new spirals forming where old ones unraveled, a reminder that stability was often just motion viewed from too far away. Threx arrived without ceremony, its heavy steps measured, its posture taut in a way Mara had come to recognize as controlled urgency. Tomas followed a moment later, his expression drawn, the lines at the corners of his eyes deeper than before. Threx began immediately. The probability spike has crossed a threshold, it said. Multiple actors are converging on a single solution path. Mara turned. Define solution. Force, Threx replied. Limited, deniable, sufficient to compel revision of the preservation designation. Tomas exhaled sharply. They want to break it without looking like they did. Yes, Threx said. The Aurelians are coordinating through intermediaries, independent extraction fleets, security contractors, and at least one minor polity seeking favor. Mara closed her eyes for a moment, letting the information settle. Targets, the preservation zone itself, Threx said. Specifically one of the outer worlds, a demonstration that exploitation can occur without immediate catastrophe, and if it does not, Tomas asked, they will attempt to manage the narrative, Threx said. If it does, they will proceed more aggressively. Mara felt a familiar anger flare, sharp and hot. They are willing to gamble with living systems to make a point. They believe the risk acceptable, Threx said. Acceptable to whom? Mara said softly. Silence stretched, heavy with the weight of unspoken answers. Mara turned back to the viewport, watching the gas giant's storms. Humanity had learned that survival often meant choosing between bad options. This was another such moment, but the scale was larger, the consequences harder to contain. What do we have, she asked, that they do not expect? Tomas leaned against the wall, arms folded. We have people willing to go where they should not, for reasons that are not profit. Threx tilted its head. Clarify. Mara turned to face them. Human adaptability is not just technical, it is social. We can form coalitions quickly, across lines that others treat as rigid. Tomas nodded slowly. There are species watching this closely, smaller ones, those who have been burned by expansion before. They lack power, Threx said. They lack massed fleets, Mara replied. They do not lack presence. Threx considered this. You propose a collective response. Yes, Mara said. Not military, observational, protective. Tomas frowned. They will call it interference. They already do, Mara said. The difference is numbers, visibility. Threx's eyes flickered as it processed. A convergence of observers would complicate deniability and raise the cost of violence, Mara said. No one wants to be seen destroying a living world under 1,000 lenses. Tomas pushed off the wall. We would need coordination fast, trust faster. Humans specialize in trust under pressure, Mara said. It is not always wise, but it is effective. Threx inclined its head. The conclave will participate. Mara met its gaze. I know. They moved quickly, urgency sharpening every decision. Messages went out through channels that bypassed formal hierarchies, reaching researchers, traders, independent captains, and diplomats who owed favors or shared concerns. The call was simple and deliberately narrow. Be present, observe, document, and do not engage unless attacked. The preservation zone would become crowded, not with weapons, but with witnesses. The response exceeded expectations. Within days, ships began altering course, their transponders broadcasting affiliations that ranged from academic institutions to cultural exchanges. Some belonged to species Mara had only encountered in passing, their names obscure, their influence minimal on any map that measured power conventionally. Together, however, they formed a dense web of attention. Sensor arrays overlapped, data streams interlinked, redundancy layered upon redundancy. The preservation zone lit up with awareness. The Aurelian reaction was swift and predictably indignant. Their speaker issued statements condemning the mobility blockade, accusing humanity of orchestrating a spectacle to constrain legitimate development. The assembly convened emergency sessions, its moderator's voice strained as it attempted to frame the situation as procedural rather than existential. Mara attended remotely, her image projected into the chamber, her words chosen with care. "This is not a blockade," she said calmly, addressing the assembly. "No access has been denied beyond existing restrictions. Observation is not interference. Transparency is not aggression." Some members nodded, others shifted uncomfortably. The Aurelian speaker's skin flared, its tone sharp. "You have created a hostile environment." Mara met its gaze through the projection. "Hostility requires intent to harm. We intend to watch." The first confrontation came not with weapons, but with law. A coalition of extraction firms filed an injunction with the assembly, arguing that the convergence of observers constituted economic sabotage. The case moved quickly, faster than normal, a sign of pressure applied behind the scenes. Mara's legal teams worked around the clock, supported by Karth analysts who dissected every clause and precedent. Tomas coordinated testimony from independent observers, their statements painting a picture of collective concern rather than coordinated attack. As the legal battle raged, ships continued to arrive. The preservation zone became a microcosm of interstellar society, diverse and tense, united by a shared understanding that something fragile was at stake. Mara visited the coordination hub established on Kepri Reach, a converted cargo bay filled with holo displays and translation nodes. She walked among crews and delegates, listening more than she spoke, absorbing the texture of their fears and hopes. One encounter stayed with her. A representative of a species whose homeworld had been strip-mined generations earlier stood before a display of a living ocean world, its microbial blooms visible from orbit. The representative's body bore scars of adaptation, evidence of survival in harsher environments. "We did not have this," it said, its voice quiet. "When they came for us, no one watched." Mara swallowed. "They are watching now." The legal injunction was denied narrowly. The assembly cited insufficient evidence of harm, emphasizing the temporary nature of the observation. It was a fragile victory, one that could be overturned with a single incident. Mara knew it. So did everyone else. That incident came sooner than she hoped. A private security vessel, operating under contract to an extraction firm, crossed into the preservation zone at high speed, its transponder broadcasting emergency codes. Its trajectory suggested a collision course with one of the observed worlds. Alarms flared across the coordination hub as sensors tracked its approach. The vessel transmitted a garbled distress signal, claiming reactor instability. Tomas was at Mara's side instantly. "They are forcing the issue." Threx's voice came through the channel, steady but urgent. Analysis indicates the instability is fabricated. The vessel intends atmospheric entry. Mara's mind raced. If the vessel entered atmosphere, even a controlled descent could contaminate ecosystems. Intercepting it would risk being framed as aggression. Doing nothing would invite catastrophe. Options, she said. Interception by non-human observers, Tomas said. Minimize human involvement. Risky, Threx said, but viable. Mara made the decision. Do it. Record everything. The interception unfolded in agonizing minutes. 2 vessels, 1 Karth and 1 belonging to a minor polity known for its pacifist doctrine, maneuvered into position. They broadcast repeated warnings, offering assistance. The security vessel ignored them until the last moment, then cut power abruptly. The interceptors responded instantly, deploying containment fields that stabilized the trajectory and prevented atmospheric breach. The maneuver was elegant, precise, and captured from a dozen angles. The aftermath was chaos. The security firm accused the interceptors of endangering their vessel. The interceptors released full telemetry, revealing the deception. The assembly convened again, its members visibly shaken. The evidence was damning, the narrative clear. This had not been an accident, it had been a test, and it had failed. Public opinion shifted, not uniformly, but enough to matter. Media channels replayed the interception, commentators dissecting the implications. The preservation zone, once an abstract legal designation, became a symbol. Humanity's role was scrutinized, criticized, and in some quarters praised. Mara accepted all of it, knowing that symbols were double-edged. The Aurelians withdrew their contractors, publicly at least. Their speaker issued a statement expressing concern over escalating misunderstandings and calling for renewed dialogue. The assembly extended the preservation status indefinitely, pending comprehensive study. It was more than Mara had dared hope for, though she knew it was not permanent. Exhaustion hit her like a delayed wave. In the days that followed, she delegated more, slept when she could, and allowed herself moments of stillness she had denied herself during the crisis. Kepri Reach slowly returned to its baseline hum, though the undercurrent of vigilance remained. Threx requested one final meeting before departing. They stood again in the observation chamber, the gas giant below serene for once, its storms muted. "You have altered more than a single outcome," Threx said. "You have demonstrated a method." Mara smiled faintly. "Methods spread." "Yes," Threx said. "So do responses." She nodded. "I am not naive. This will not be the last time." "No," Threx agreed, "but the next will be different." After Threx left, Tomas lingered. "You realize what you have done," he said. "I have a general idea," Mara replied. "You have shown that humanity can be a fulcrum without being a blade," he said. "Some will hate you for that." "Some already do," she said. He studied her. "Was it worth it?" Mara looked out at the borrowed stars beyond the gas giant, at the fragile lives spinning in their light. "Ask me again in 20 years," she said. "If those worlds are still alive, I will say yes without hesitation." As Tomas left, Mara remained, feeling the station's quiet resilience beneath her feet. Humanity had not claimed territory or imposed rule. It had stood in the way, long enough for others to see what was at risk. The weight of that choice pressed on her, heavy and constant, but it was a weight she knew how to carry. Humans had been carrying heavier ones since they first looked up at a cracked sky and decided to leave, not in triumph, but in responsibility. Time did what it always did after crisis. It normalized the extraordinary without ever quite erasing it. The preservation zone became a fixed feature on navigational charts, its provisional markers replaced with language that suggested permanence without promising it. Trade routes adjusted, skirting its boundaries with a caution that felt, to Mara, like a collective memory being formed in real time. Kepri Reach settled into a new equilibrium, one that carried the faint tension of a scar that had healed but still ached when pressed. Mara returned to routines she had neglected, though they no longer felt the same. Every cargo manifest carried implications she had learned to read between the lines. Every diplomatic request was weighed not just for its immediate impact, but for the precedent it might set. She found herself thinking in longer arcs, imagining how today's compromises would look when refracted through decades. It was exhausting, but it was also clarifying. Humanity's place was no longer simply reactive, it had become referential. Others looked to human behavior not because humans were strongest, but because they were legible. That legibility was a vulnerability and a tool. The Assembly's investigation into the staged incursion concluded with language as careful as it was revealing. No single party was formally blamed, but guidelines were tightened, enforcement mechanisms clarified, and a new oversight council proposed. Humanity was offered a seat on that council, framed as recognition of its constructive engagement. The offer came with caveats, expectations, and an unspoken assumption of compliance. Mara read the proposal 3 times before forwarding it to Tomas. When they met to discuss it, he looked more tired than she had ever seen him, the kind of tired that came from running on purpose for too long. "They want us inside," he said, "where we can be managed. They want us responsible," Mara replied, "so blame can be shared." Tomas smiled thinly. "Responsibility is never shared equally." "No," she agreed, "but it can be leveraged." They debated the offer for hours, weighing influence against entanglement. Declining outright would signal withdrawal and invite marginalization. Accepting without conditions would risk co-option. In the end, they crafted a counter-proposal, one that accepted the seat but demanded transparency requirements that would apply to all council members equally. It was a gamble, but one rooted in the same strategy that had carried them this far: make the cost of hypocrisy higher than the cost of honesty. The Assembly's response was delayed, then cautiously affirmative. The Oversight Council was formed, its mandate narrow but real. Humanity took its seat alongside powers far older and more entrenched. Some welcomed the fresh perspective. Others regarded it as an irritant that would, in time, be worn down. Outside the chambers of power, consequences rippled in quieter ways. Independent research initiatives flourished, inspired by the preservation zone's visibility. Students from species that rarely collaborated began joint programs, their work funded by coalitions that had found common cause during the crisis. Kepri Reach hosted symposiums that were less about consensus than about exposure, giving space to voices that rarely carried beyond their local systems. Mara attended when she could, listening to debates that ranged from ethical frameworks to practical survival strategies. Not all consequences were positive. Several human trade outposts reported increased scrutiny and occasional harassment. Insurance premiums remained high, and some partners quietly reduced engagement. Within human networks, dissent grew louder. There were those who argued that humanity was overextending, that it was risking its hard-won stability for ideals that others could afford to ignore. Mara read their messages late at night, recognizing the fear beneath the criticism. She did not dismiss them. Fear had kept humanity alive as often as courage, but she also knew that retreat carried its own risks. Humanity had survived by adapting, by inserting itself into systems larger than itself and reshaping them just enough to fit. Withdrawal now would not return them to safety. It would leave a vacuum others would fill. The next challenge did not come from the Aurelians or the Assembly, but from within the preservation zone itself. Human and Karth researchers identified a previously unknown migratory pattern among the region's larger life forms, one that suggested the worlds were not isolated systems, but nodes in a broader ecological network. The implications were profound. Protecting individual planets would not be enough. Disruption in one area could cascade across light years, affecting worlds that had already been charted and, in some cases, settled. Mara convened an emergency briefing with Tomas, Threx, and representatives from several observer groups. The data filled the room, a web of trajectories and timelines that defied easy comprehension. "This changes the scale," Tomas said quietly. "Yes," Threx replied. The preservation zone may be only a fragment of a larger system. Mara felt a familiar tightening in her chest. If we are already disrupting it, we do not know, Threx said, but ignorance is no longer defensible. The discovery forced a reckoning. Existing charters and designations were insufficient to address networks that spanned regions and jurisdictions. The assembly's mechanisms moved too slowly, bound by frameworks designed for discrete territories. Meanwhile, exploratory missions beyond the preservation zone risked unintended harm. Humanity found itself again at a junction. It could push for expanded protections, escalating tensions, and drawing further scrutiny. Or it could limit dissemination of the findings, focusing on mitigation within the existing zone and hoping the broader system remained resilient. Mara did not hesitate. "We share everything," she said, "with everyone." Tomas looked at her, searching. "That will cause panic. It will cause adjustment," she replied. "Panic comes from surprise." Threx inclined its head. "The conclave agrees. Systems-level awareness is essential." The data release was unprecedented in scope. Raw findings, methodologies, uncertainties, all made public. The reaction was immediate and intense. Some hailed it as a breakthrough in ecological understanding. Others accused humanity of sabotaging expansion through information overload. Markets fluctuated as speculative ventures recalibrated. Political blocs fractured along lines that did not map neatly onto species or alliances. The Assembly convened an emergency summit, its largest in decades. Mara attended in person, her presence both symbolic and practical. The chamber buzzed with a level of tension she had never felt before. This was not a dispute over territory or resources. It was a confrontation with limits that no one had wanted to acknowledge. Debate raged for days. Proposals were made, discarded, resurrected. New coalitions formed in real time, their members bound by shared vulnerability rather than shared ambition. Humanity's role was contested openly. Some delegates accused humans of destabilizing the interstellar order. Others argued that humans had simply exposed an instability that already existed. When Mara finally spoke, it was not with prepared rhetoric. She spoke, as she always had, plainly and without adornment. She spoke of Earth, not as a tragedy to be weaponized, but as a lesson learned too late. She spoke of the first ships, of ledgers and seeds, of a species that had learned to survive by planning beyond its own lifespan. She did not ask for deference. She asked for patience. "We are very good at adapting to broken systems," she said. "We would prefer not to have to." The summit ended without sweeping resolutions, but it did not end in stalemate. Working groups were formed, mandates expanded, timelines extended. It was incremental, unsatisfying to those who wanted clarity, but it was movement. The ecological network would be studied as a whole. Development plans would require systems-level impact assessments. Enforcement remained an open question, but the language had shifted. In the aftermath, Mara returned to Kepri Reach, carrying a fatigue that settled deep in her bones. She took a rare day off, walking the station's lesser-used corridors, watching the interplay of lives that had nothing to do with preservation zones or councils. Children of mixed species played in a low-gravity recreation ring, their laughter echoing. Vendors argued amicably over stall placement. Life went on, fragile and stubborn. She found herself thinking of legacy, a concept she had avoided for most of her career. Humans had learned to think in terms of continuity rather than conquest, but continuity required choices that outlasted individuals. What would remain when she stepped aside? Would the methods they had pioneered endure, or would they be eroded by convenience and fatigue? Her thoughts were interrupted by a message from Tomas, brief and uncharacteristically informal. "You should see this." She met him in the coordination hub, where a small crowd had gathered around a central display. The image showed a world at the edge of the preservation zone, one of the earliest documented. New data overlays highlighted subtle changes in atmospheric composition, patterns that suggested stabilization rather than disruption. The ecological models updated, projections shifting toward resilience. "What am I looking at?" Mara asked. "Adaptation," Tomas said. "The system is responding to observation." To reduced pressure, Threx's voice came through the channel, carrying a note of something that might have been wonder. "The network appears capable of self-regulation when disturbances are minimized." Mara stared at the display, a slow smile spreading across her face. "We did not save it," she said softly. "No," Tomas replied. "We gave it room." The realization settled over the room, quiet and profound. Humanity had not imposed order or enforced control. It had stepped back, long enough for something else to assert itself. It was not a guarantee of safety, but it was evidence that restraint could be as powerful as intervention. That night, Mara returned to the observation chamber alone. The gas giant below was calm, its storms distant, its colors muted. Beyond it, the borrowed stars shone with indifferent patience. Humanity's future remained uncertain, contested, fragile. But for the first time in a long while, Mara felt something close to confidence, not in outcomes, but in process. Humans had learned to survive by borrowing time. Now, perhaps, they were learning how to give it back. The years that followed did not feel like years while they were happening. They felt like maintenance cycles, each one demanding attention before the previous was fully complete. Crises still arose, but fewer of them carried the sharp edge of existential threat. Instead, they were slow, grinding challenges that required persistence rather than heroics. Humanity adapted to that rhythm with the same stubborn pragmatism that had carried it off its homeworld. The Oversight Council met regularly, its debates less theatrical now that the Preservation Network had become an accepted fact rather than a provocation. Enforcement remained imperfect, but violations grew rarer, not because temptation vanished, but because the cost of being seen ignoring limits had become too high for most actors to bear. Mara aged in ways that were subtle and unmistakable. Her hair silvered at the temples, her joints complained more loudly when she spent too long in low gravity, and her patience, already legendary, deepened into something that felt almost geological. She remained at Kepri Reach by choice, turning down offers that would have placed her in more prestigious, more comfortable positions. Prestige, she had learned, was often a signal that the real work had already been decided elsewhere. At the Reach, decisions still mattered. The station itself evolved. New modules were added, grown and welded in a careful balance of technologies, expanding habitation space and research facilities. Its population diversified further, families forming across species lines in ways that would have seemed improbable a generation earlier. Children grew up bilingual, trilingual, their minds shaped by assumptions of coexistence rather than dominance. Not all of them stayed. Some left for colonies still struggling to define themselves. Others joined exploratory fleets that now carried stricter ethical mandates than any in history. They took with them the unspoken lesson of the Reach, that survival was a collective practice. Tomas transitioned out of formal representation after a decade on the Oversight Council. He cited exhaustion, though Mara suspected a deeper reason. He had always been most effective at the edge of systems, not inside them. Before he left, he spent weeks compiling institutional memory, recording not just decisions, but the reasoning behind them, the hesitations and doubts that never made it into official minutes. He handed the archive to Mara personally. "People forget why they chose restraint," he said. "They remember only that it was inconvenient." She accepted the archive with a solemn nod. "They will have this," she said, "and they will have us for as long as we last." Threx remained a constant presence, though less visible to the public. The Conclave's trade routes continued to support Kepri Reach, their partnership now assumed rather than questioned. Threx itself returned periodically, each visit marked by incremental changes in its demeanor that suggested adaptation not unlike that observed in the Preservation Network. It spoke more often in hypotheticals now, less in probabilities, a shift that Mara found both unsettling and encouraging. During one such visit, Threx accompanied Mara on a slow walk through one of the station's older habitation rings, where the artificial gravity fluctuated just enough to remind residents of its absence. They passed a communal garden, its plants a carefully curated mix of species, their growth patterns interwoven in deliberate complexity. The Conclave has revised its long-term projections, Threx said. Mara glanced at it. I assume that happens often. This revision is significant, Threx replied. It incorporates human behavioral variables. She smiled faintly. That sounds dangerous. It is, Threx said without irony. Your species introduces uncertainty that resists reduction, and yet you continue to work with us. Yes, Threx said, because uncertainty is now correlated with resilience. Mara stopped, looking at the garden. That may be the nicest thing anyone has ever said about humanity, Threx considered. It is not intended as praise, it is a conclusion. The preservation network continued to reveal its intricacies. As data accumulated, patterns emerged that reshaped scientific understanding of life's capacity for coordination across distance and time. The worlds were not passive. They responded to stellar shifts, to gravitational tides, to each other. Life, it seemed, had always been negotiating, long before sentience gave it language. Humanity's role in observing rather than exploiting allowed those negotiations to continue uninterrupted, a fact that gradually softened even the most ardent critics. Not all accepted this shift. There were still factions, human and otherwise, that viewed restraint as weakness. Some operated at the margins, testing boundaries, probing for lapses in enforcement. Most were caught, a few were not. When damage occurred, it was documented, mourned, and addressed where possible. The difference now was that denial had become harder to sustain. The borrowed stars were no longer abstract backdrops for ambition. They were participants in a shared system whose failure would not respect borders. Mara's health declined slowly, predictably. She adapted, delegating more, trusting the structures she had helped build. When she finally announced her intention to step down from active logistics coordination, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Messages poured in from across the sector, some formal, some deeply personal. She read them all, though she did not respond to most. Gratitude, she had learned, was best acknowledged by continuity rather than ceremony. Her successor was chosen not for charisma or political leverage, but for a quality Mara recognized instantly, an ability to sit with complexity without rushing to simplify it. The transition was meticulous, every system and contingency reviewed. On her final day in office, Mara walked the length of Dock 17, where years earlier she had watched a battered freighter arrive carrying the seeds of upheaval. The dock bustled as always, cargo moving, ships cycling in and out, life persisting in motion. She paused at the edge, feeling the vibration of the station through her boots. For a moment, memory layered itself over the present, the first ships leaving Earth, the storm-lit gas giant, the chamber debates, the interception that could have gone so wrong. Humanity's story, she realized, was not one of ascension or conquest. It was a story of calibration, of learning how to exist without consuming everything within reach. In retirement, if it could be called that, Mara took on an advisory role that allowed her long stretches of reflection. She spent time in the observation chamber, now less frequented, watching the gas giant's storms trace patterns she had come to recognize. She mentored younger coordinators, not by instructing them on what to do, but by telling them what had nearly failed. She spoke openly of mistakes, of moments when fear had almost driven her to safer but worse choices. One evening, long after artificial dusk had settled, she received a visit from a delegation she did not expect. They were young, by their species, standards, representatives of a coalition formed by those who had grown up in the shadow of the preservation network. Their cultures varied, their physiologies incompatible in most ways, but they shared a common vocabulary shaped by observation rather than extraction. "We wanted to thank you," one of them said, its voice steady despite the emotional weight beneath it. Mara shook her head gently. "You do not owe me anything." "We know," the representative said. "That is why we are here." They spoke of projects underway, of plans to extend systems-level thinking to regions beyond the original network. They did not ask for permission. They asked for perspective. Mara listened, offering caution where needed, encouragement where deserved. When they left, she felt a quiet satisfaction that surprised her with its depth. Years later, as her body grew less cooperative, Mara made one final journey, not physically, but through data. She reviewed the earliest survey records of the preservation zone, comparing them to the most recent. The changes were subtle but undeniable. Life persisted, adapted, flourished in ways no model had predicted. The network was not pristine. It bore marks of observation, of proximity. But it was alive, dynamic, its future unwritten. On her last visit to the observation chamber, Mara sat rather than stood. The gas giant filled the viewport, serene and distant. Beyond it, the borrowed stars burned with their ancient indifference. Humanity's place among them remained contested, uncertain, fragile, but it also remained present. She thought of Earth not as a wound, but as an origin. A place where limits had been learned the hard way. She thought of the ledgers and seeds, of promises made without assurance they could be kept. Humanity had kept enough of them to matter. When her breathing slowed and the station lights dimmed in response, Mara felt no fear. She had lived long enough to see a pattern disrupted, not shattered, but bent. She had seen humanity choose patience over haste, restraint over dominance, observation over consumption. She knew those choices would be tested again, perhaps overturned in places, but she also knew they now existed as options, as memories others could draw upon. The station continued without her. Ships arrived and departed. Councils argued. Worlds turned. Life negotiated its place in the vastness with the same quiet persistence it always had. Humanity remained what it had become among the stars, not masters, not saviors, but stewards by necessity, borrowers who had learned that some debts were not meant to be repaid in kind, but honored through care. And in that ongoing negotiation, under the weight of borrowed stars, the future stayed open.